On a July afternoon in 2015, a 61-year-old man named Walter Pruitt stood in the dust of his own garage in Millbrook, Ohio, holding a small cardboard box that had not been opened since the Reagan administration. He almost threw it away without looking inside. If he had, this story would have ended exactly the way it ended for 28 years, unfinished, unanswered, and quietly rotting in a filing cabinet at the Millbrook Police Department, under a case number nobody expected to close. Instead, Walter opened the box. Inside were 4 rolls of black and white film, brittle rubber bands crumbling around their canisters, and a torn strip of masking tape with 4 words written in faded blue ink: Ashford wedding, do not use. What was recorded on those 4 rolls of film would end up rewriting everything a small town thought it knew about the disappearance of a 24-year-old bride named Karen Ashford, who vanished from her own wedding reception on June 13, 1987, and was never seen again. Or at least, never seen again by anyone who was looking in the right place. To understand why those 4 rolls of film mattered so much, you have to go back to the beginning, back to a town so small that everyone at that wedding either taught Karen in Sunday school, coached her in softball, or had watched her grow up 2 houses down the street. Millbrook, Ohio sat in the flat farm country about 40 minutes outside of Columbus, the kind of town with one blinking traffic light, a Methodist church, a Lutheran church, a diner called the Millbrook Grill, and a grain silo that dominated the skyline more than any building ever could. Everybody knew everybody. And in the summer of 1987, everybody in Millbrook was talking about one thing: the wedding of Karen Ashford and David Whitman. Karen was the younger of 2 daughters, born to Robert and Diane Ashford. Robert ran the town's only hardware store, a narrow brick building on Main Street that had been in his family for 3 generations. Diane taught 2nd grade at Millbrook Elementary, the same school where half the town had learned to read. Karen had grown up in a small white house on Sycamore Street, with a wraparound porch and a swing her father built when she was 7. She was the kind of girl teachers wrote, "A pleasure to have in class" about on every single report card. She played the clarinet in the high school band, ran track for 2 years before deciding she preferred watching from the bleachers, and worked weekends at her father's hardware store, ringing up customers and stocking nails into little wooden bins. Her older sister, Melissa, was 27 that summer, married with a toddler of her own, living just outside of town. Melissa and Karen had always been close, the kind of sisters who called each other every single day, even when there was nothing to say. David Whitman had grown up 2 streets over on Chestnut Avenue. He and Karen had known each other since kindergarten, but they didn't actually start dating until their junior year of high school, when David worked up the nerve to ask her to the homecoming dance after weeks of practicing the question in front of his bedroom mirror. By the time they graduated, everyone in Millbrook simply assumed they would end up married. David went on to study agricultural business at Ohio State, planning to eventually take over his father's grain and feed supply company. Karen stayed closer to home, taking classes at the community college and working at the hardware store, waiting for David to finish school. When he proposed in the fall of 1985, dropping to one knee in the exact spot on the football field where he'd asked her to that homecoming dance years earlier, nobody in town was surprised. What did surprise people, just slightly, was how long they waited to actually get married. Nearly 2 years passed between the engagement and the wedding date, largely because David's father had fallen ill and the family needed time before they could properly celebrate. When June of 1987 finally arrived, it felt to the whole town like the closing of a very long, very sweet chapter. What almost nobody in Millbrook remembered by then, and what none of David's friends had ever bothered to mention to him, was that Karen had briefly dated someone else during her sophomore year of high school, a boy 2 years older named Thomas Rayner, who lived out past the county line in a cluster of trailers and modest rented houses that Millbrook's more established families referred to, not always kindly, as Rayner's Bend. Thomas had a reputation, fair or not, for a short temper and a family history of hard drinking, and when Robert Ashford found out his 16-year-old daughter was sneaking out to meet him at the quarry pond after dark, he had put a stop to it within a week, driving out to the Rayner house himself and telling Thomas's father in language the whole family remembered for years afterward, that his son was to stay away from Karen for good. Karen had cried for exactly 3 days, by Melissa's recollection, and then, being 17 and obedient by nature, had simply let it go. Thomas Rayner moved away not long after, taking construction work wherever it could be found, and by the time Karen started dating David seriously in her junior year, the whole episode had faded into the kind of half-remembered high school footnote that nobody thought worth bringing up again. Certainly nobody thought to mention it to Detective Doyle in 1987. It hadn't seemed relevant. It was ancient history, over and done with, a closed door that nobody in Millbrook imagined had ever been quietly left unlocked. The rehearsal dinner, held 2 nights before the wedding at the Millbrook Grill, was by every account a warm, ordinary affair. Robert Ashford gave a toast that made him cry before he'd finished the second sentence, something he'd never once done in public in his entire life, which made half the room laugh through their own tears. David's father, weakened by the illness that had delayed the wedding for so long, insisted on standing to give his own toast, despite his family's protests, leaning on his wife's arm the entire time, and told the room that watching his son grow into the kind of man who deserved a girl like Karen Ashford was the proudest accomplishment of his life. Karen sat between her mother and her sister that night, and more than one person would later recall, when asked to remember every last detail of those final days, that she had seemed unusually quiet through dessert, staring at her water glass for long stretches before catching herself and smiling again. At the time, nobody thought anything of it. Brides get nervous. Brides get overwhelmed. Nobody in that room had any reason to believe her silence meant anything more complicated than pre-wedding jitters. The morning of the wedding was overcast, grey clouds hanging low over the cornfields, and Diane Ashford spent the first hour of daylight anxiously checking the sky through the kitchen window, convinced the whole day would be ruined by rain. By 10 o'clock, the clouds broke apart and gave way to one of those perfect early summer days that seemed to exist only in memory, all soft golden light and a breeze that smelled like cut grass. Karen got ready at her parents' house on Sycamore Street with her mother, her sister Melissa, and 3 bridesmaids who had been her closest friends since middle school. The photographer hired for the day, a soft-spoken, methodical man named Gary Holt, who ran the only real photography studio within 20 miles, arrived at the house at 11 with his assistant, a 23-year-old named Walter Pruitt, who had been working for Gary for less than a year. Gary Holt had built a reputation across 3 counties for his careful, formal wedding portraits, the kind that ended up in gilded frames on mantelpieces for the next 50 years. But Gary had also become quietly obsessed, in the way only a certain kind of artist gets obsessed, with something more experimental, unposed, candid, documentary-style photography, shot in black and white on a completely separate camera, capturing the small, unguarded moments that never made it into the formal album. He'd been building a private portfolio of these candid shots for 2 years, hoping to eventually show them in a gallery in Columbus. He handed that side project entirely to Walter. Walter's job that day was simple. While Gary handled the posed portraits and the formal ceremony shots on color film, Walter was to wander quietly through the background with his own camera loaded with black and white film, capturing whatever caught his eye, whatever felt honest. Nobody paid him much attention. He was young, unassuming, and good at making himself invisible, which was exactly what made him good at his job. The Ashford house that morning smelled like hairspray and coffee, and the particular nervous energy of a household running on almost no sleep. Diane Ashford had been up since 5, pressing the hem of Karen's dress a second, and then a third time even though it hadn't needed it the first, filling the kitchen with the smell of biscuits nobody had the appetite to eat. Melissa arrived at 8 with her 18-month-old son on her hip and a curling iron already plugged in before she'd taken off her coat. The 3 bridesmaids, Karen's closest friends since middle school, a school teacher named Patty, a nurse named Judy, and a young mother named Connie who'd driven up from Cincinnati the night before, filled the small upstairs bathroom with laughter, loud enough that Robert Ashford, sitting alone downstairs in his good suit 2 hours before he needed to be dressed, could hear it through the floorboards, and found himself smiling despite the tightness in his own chest. Karen herself moved through the morning with a kind of practiced calm that everyone around her mistook for simple bridal composure. She answered every question asked of her. She laughed at Connie's jokes. She let her mother fuss over the veil 3 separate times without complaint. It was only in the smaller, quieter gaps between tasks, the few minutes here and there, when nobody was actively looking at her, that something else surfaced in her face. Something Melissa would spend the next 28 years trying to properly describe to Detective Reyes, and never quite managing. Not doubt exactly, not fear exactly. Something closer to a held breath that never seemed to fully release. At the Ashford house that morning, Walter photographed Melissa curling Karen's hair, Diane crying at the sight of her daughter in the dress, the bridesmaids laughing over a bottle of champagne someone had smuggled into the bedroom far too early in the day. He photographed Karen alone for a moment, sitting at her childhood vanity mirror, staring at her own reflection with an expression Walter would later describe to police as unreadable. Not sad, not scared, just very far away, as though she were doing complicated arithmetic behind her eyes. He almost didn't take the photograph. It felt like an intrusion. He took it anyway, because that was the job, and then he moved on, and neither he nor anyone else thought about that photograph again for 28 years. The ceremony took place at 2 o'clock at St. Andrew's Lutheran Church on Miller Road, the same church where Karen had been baptized and confirmed. The pews were packed. Nearly 200 people crowded into a building meant for 150, spilling out into the vestibule, craning their necks to watch. David cried openly when Karen came down the aisle on her father's arm, and there was a ripple of laughter through the church when he had to wipe his face with the back of his hand before he could say his vows. By every account given afterward, by every single person who stood in that church, Karen looked radiant, and more importantly, Karen looked happy. Her father, Robert, would later tell Detective Frank Doyle that he had never seen his daughter smile the way she smiled that afternoon. That detail would matter enormously in the years to come, because it meant that whatever happened to Karen Ashford did not happen because she walked down that aisle with doubt in her heart. Something happened after. Pastor Elliot, who had known Karen since she was baptized at that very altar 24 years earlier, later told a reporter that he had performed hundreds of weddings in his career and could count on one hand the number of times a couple had cried through their own vows, the way David and Karen did that afternoon. David's best man, his cousin Steve, stood up during the reception and gave a toast that mentioned, almost in passing, that he had never seen David nervous about anything in his entire life except the 15 minutes before Karen came down that aisle, when David had paced the small anteroom of St. Andrew's so many times that Steve joked he'd worn a groove into the floor. The room laughed. Karen laughed too, sitting at the head table in her wedding dress, her hand resting on David's arm, looking, in the photographs Gary Holt took of that exact moment, entirely and uncomplicatedly happy. It was one of the cruelest details of the entire case, in Detective Doyle's own assessment years later. There was no single photograph, no single witness account, nothing anywhere in the entire record of that day that showed even a flicker of the decision Karen was going to make before the night was through. The reception was held at the Millbrook Grange Hall, a squat brick building on the edge of town, normally used for 4-H meetings and Christmas bazaars, transformed for one night into something out of a magazine, with white paper lanterns strung across the rafters and folding tables draped in ivory cloth. Nearly the entire town showed up. There was a live band, a local 4-piece outfit that played everything from Sinatra to Bon Jovi. There was a buffet line that stretched out the door. There was a 5-tier cake baked by Karen's aunt. And there were disposable cameras, 22 of them, placed on every table by Melissa's request, so that every guest could capture their own version of the night. A popular trend that summer, among brides who couldn't afford a second professional photographer, but wanted more candid coverage than one camera could provide. Those disposable cameras would later become critically important, but on the night of June 13, 1987, they were just a fun little detail, and nobody thought about them twice. The band, a local four-piece outfit called the Wayfarers, who played every wedding and county fair within a 50-mile radius, opened with an upbeat cover of a Huey Lewis song that got even the oldest guests up onto the dance floor within the first 10 minutes. Robert Ashford, normally a stiff and reluctant dancer, surprised everyone by doing a full spin with his daughter during the father-daughter dance, a move Melissa swore he must have been secretly practicing for weeks. Diane spent most of the evening moving from table to table, refilling coffee cups and accepting compliments on the flowers, the cake, the weather, the whole beautiful day, glowing with a happiness she would later describe, in the darkest years of the investigation, as the last truly uncomplicated joy she ever felt in her life. Children from the extended family ran barefoot across the Grange Hall's side lawn while the adults danced, and somebody's grandfather fell asleep in a folding chair with a half-eaten piece of cake still balanced on his knee, and for those first 3 hours, before the light began to fade, it was, by every single account gathered afterward, simply a perfect small-town wedding, unremarkable in the very best way a wedding can be unremarkable. By all accounts, the first 3 hours of the reception were exactly what everyone expected: joyful, loud, a little chaotic, full of dancing and toasts, and the particular kind of happy exhaustion that settles over a room at the end of a long-awaited celebration. David's best man gave a toast that made half the room cry. Karen's father danced with her to a song that had been playing on the radio the day she was born. Around 8:30, as the light outside began to fade into that long gold Ohio dusk, the band slowed the tempo, and the garter toss and bouquet toss were called. This is where things get harder to reconstruct, because this is where the timeline starts to fracture into pieces that different witnesses remember slightly differently. What is agreed upon is this. Sometime around 8:45, a member of the catering staff approached Karen near the edge of the dance floor and told her that someone was asking for her by the side entrance, near the kitchen doors. Nobody working that night could later remember exactly who had sent that message or who was waiting. The catering staff at the Grange Hall that evening were mostly high school students hired for the summer, and in the chaos of the reception, the detail simply slipped past everyone's memory. Melissa, who was standing nearby, saw Karen's expression shift the moment she heard the message. It wasn't panic. It was something closer to recognition, the look of someone hearing a name they hadn't expected to hear that day. Karen excused herself and walked toward the side doors near the kitchen. She was gone for approximately 15 minutes. When she returned to the reception, David would later say she seemed distracted, quieter than before, and when he asked her if everything was all right, she told him it was nothing, just an old friend from high school passing through town who'd heard about the wedding and wanted to say congratulations. David believed her. Why wouldn't he have? It was his wedding day. He had no reason in the world to suspect that his brand new wife had just been handed a folded piece of paper that would change the rest of both of their lives. The reception continued. The cake was cut around 9:15. There was more dancing. Around 10:30, as the older guests began drifting home and the younger crowd settled in for a few more hours of dancing, Karen told David she was tired and wanted to change out of her wedding dress into the simple ivory dress she'd brought for the after-party, and that she'd be right back. She walked toward the small side room the Grange Hall used as a bridal changing area, carrying a garment bag Melissa had hung there earlier in the day. That was the last time anyone can confirm, with total certainty, that they saw Karen Ashford alive. By 11 o'clock, David began to worry. He knocked on the door of the changing room and got no answer. He asked one of the bridesmaids to check inside, and she found the room empty, the wedding dress draped carefully over a folding chair, Karen's shoes tucked neatly beneath it, her small evening purse sitting untouched on the table with her identification, her cash, and the extra set of car keys still inside. The ivory after-party dress was gone. So was Karen. At first, nobody panicked. Brides disappear from their own receptions all the time, people told each other, laughing nervously. Probably just needed some air. Probably went outside to cry happy tears with one of her girlfriends. Probably slipped out back for a smoke, even though nobody had ever seen her smoke in her life. David walked the parking lot. He walked the gravel road behind the Grange Hall. He checked the bathroom twice. By midnight, the laughter had stopped completely, and Robert Ashford called the Millbrook Police Department from the payphone in the Grange Hall lobby, his voice shaking so badly the dispatcher had trouble understanding him at first. Detective Frank Doyle arrived at the Grange Hall a little after 12:30 in the morning. He was 44 years old that summer, a heavy-set, unhurried man who had spent almost his entire career investigating stolen farm equipment and the occasional bar fight, and who had never in his life worked a missing persons case involving a young woman who had, by every account, vanished into thin air in the middle of a wedding reception attended by 200 witnesses. Doyle walked the changing room slowly, hands in his coat pockets, the way he did everything. He noted the dress on the chair. He noted the shoes. He noted the untouched purse. He asked David to walk him through, minute by minute, everything that had happened that evening, and it was David, exhausted and frantic, who first mentioned the 15 minutes near the kitchen doors, the folded note, the old friend from high school who apparently wanted to say congratulations. Doyle asked David if he remembered the name of this old friend. David realized, with a sinking, sickening feeling, that he had never actually asked. The search that night covered every inch of the Grange Hall property and the surrounding cornfields. Volunteers, still dressed in their wedding clothes, formed lines and walked the ditches along Route 9 with flashlights. Somebody's uncle drove his truck out to the old quarry pond half a mile away, in case Karen had wandered there in the dark. The same quarry pond, though nobody at the time had any reason to connect the two, where a much younger Karen had once slipped out after dark to meet a boy named Thomas Rayner. Nothing turned up. No purse dropped in the grass, no shoe caught in a fence line, no sign at all that a young woman in an ivory dress had passed through. As the sun rose over Millbrook on the morning of June 14th, the town that had gone to sleep, celebrating the happiest day of Karen Ashford's life, woke up to learn that she was gone. By 7 that morning, word had spread through Millbrook the way it always did, by phone call and back fence, and the line at the diner counter, and by 9 o'clock, nearly 60 people had gathered at the Grange Hall parking lot, most of them still in the clothes they'd worn to the wedding less than 12 hours earlier, ready to search. Robert Ashford organized them into groups without waiting for the police to tell him how, walking the line with a legal pad, assigning sections of field and roadside the way he might have organized a barn raising, because moving, doing something with his hands and his feet, was the only thing keeping him upright. Diane sat in a folding chair near the entrance of the Grange Hall for most of that first day, unable to walk the fields herself, greeting every returning search group with the same desperate question, and receiving, every single time, the same devastating shake of the head. By that evening, the story had reached the Columbus television stations, and a young reporter stood on the gravel road outside the Grange Hall, delivering a report that would be the first of hundreds over the coming decades, describing a wedding day that had ended, in her words, in the kind of silence no small town ever expects to have to live with. The investigation that followed, in the days and weeks after, was thorough by the standards of a small-town police department in 1987, though it would look painfully limited by the standards of today. Detective Doyle interviewed every single guest at the reception, more than 180 people, asking each of them the same questions. Did you see Karen near the kitchen doors around 8:45? Did you see who she was talking to? Did anyone unfamiliar come to the reception that night? The answers were maddeningly consistent in their uselessness. People remembered seeing Karen walk toward the kitchen. Nobody remembered seeing who met her there. The catering staff, mostly teenagers working their first summer job, could not identify who had originally asked them to deliver the message to Karen in the first place, and in the confusion of a busy reception, the detail had simply evaporated from memory before anyone thought to write it down. Doyle checked the phone records for the Grange Hall and for the Ashford house. Nothing unusual. He checked Karen's bank account, which showed no activity in the days following her disappearance. He checked hospitals within a 100-mile radius. Nothing. He brought in a K9 unit from the county sheriff's department, and the dogs picked up Karen's scent in the changing room, followed it out the side door of the Grange Hall, across the gravel parking lot, and lost it entirely at the edge of the property where the gravel met the paved road. She got into a vehicle. Doyle knew it in his gut, before the science even confirmed it. Somebody drove her away from her own wedding, and whoever it was had planned it carefully enough to leave almost no trace behind. Over the following months, Doyle and the 2 part-time officers he borrowed from the county sheriff's department worked through a slow, exhausting list of possibilities, each one collapsing under scrutiny. A traveling salesman who had checked into the motel off the highway the same week was questioned and cleared after his employer confirmed his whereabouts down to the hour. A former classmate of Karen's, who had once written her an awkward, unrequited love letter, in 11th grade, was brought in for an afternoon of uncomfortable questioning and released within hours, mortified and entirely uninvolved. A psychic from Columbus contacted the Ashford family directly, insisting Karen's body would be found near water, sending Robert and a group of exhausted volunteers back out to the quarry pond for a second, third, and eventually 4th search that turned up nothing but a rusted bicycle frame that had been sitting at the bottom of the pond since long before Karen was even born. The case was featured that autumn on a nationally syndicated true crime program that specialized in unsolved disappearances, and for 2 weeks afterward, the Millbrook Police Department's single phone line rang almost constantly, with tips from as far away as Texas and Washington State, every single one of them, after careful follow-up, leading nowhere. Detective Doyle personally polygraphed David Whitman twice, in July and again in September of 1987, a decision that deeply wounded David, but one Doyle felt he owed to thoroughness rather than suspicion. Both times, David passed without any indication of deception, and Doyle would later tell a reporter that watching a 25-year-old groom sob through a polygraph test about his missing wife was one of the worst afternoons of his entire career. Doyle also quietly investigated whether Karen might have simply gotten cold feet and run on her own, without any accomplice at all, a theory he never voiced publicly out of respect for the family, but pursued anyway, checking bus station logs in 3 neighboring counties, and the passenger manifests of the 1 regional airport within driving distance. Nothing surfaced. By the time the leaves turned that October, 4 months after the wedding, Doyle had exhausted nearly every lead his small department was equipped to chase, and the file, though never officially closed, began, in the quiet, unglamorous way most cold cases do, to simply stop moving. The one piece of physical evidence that seemed promising, at least initially, was the collection of 22 disposable cameras that Melissa had placed on the reception tables. In the chaos of the following days, as the family tried to process what had happened, those cameras sat forgotten in a cardboard box in the Grange Hall's storage closet for nearly 3 weeks before anyone remembered they existed. When Melissa finally did remember, she drove straight to the pharmacy and paid to have every single roll developed, hands shaking the entire time she waited. She went through more than 400 photographs that afternoon, sitting alone in her car in the pharmacy parking lot, searching every blurry, overexposed frame for anything, any face she didn't recognize, any detail out of place. She found nothing. The disposable cameras, cheap and low quality even under the best of circumstances, had captured plenty of dancing and cake cutting and drunken toasts, but nothing near the kitchen doors, nothing that showed who Karen had gone to meet. It was, in Detective Doyle's own words to the local newspaper weeks later, the biggest disappointment of the entire investigation. Everyone had believed those cameras would crack the case wide open. Instead, they offered nothing but more silence. What almost nobody remembered, in the panic and grief of that summer, was that the disposable cameras weren't the only cameras at the wedding that day. Gary Holt, the hired photographer, had submitted his own rolls of formal color film to the police early in the investigation as a courtesy, and Doyle had gone through every single one of those photographs as well, finding nothing beyond posed smiles and careful compositions that told the police nothing about the 15 minutes near the kitchen doors. But Gary's assistant, Walter Pruitt, had shot an entire separate set of film that summer, 4 rolls of black and white candid photography intended purely as artistic practice, never meant to be part of the official wedding package, and therefore never submitted to anyone. Walter had, in fact, mostly forgotten he'd even shot the reception itself. His attention that evening had been focused on the earlier parts of the day, the getting ready photos at the Ashford house, the ceremony at St. Andrew's. He had only shot a handful of frames during the actual reception before Gary called him over to help pack up equipment early, since another wedding was booked for the following weekend and they needed to prepare. In the horror of the following weeks, as the entire town of Millbrook turned itself inside out searching for Karen, Walter developed the black and white film in Gary's darkroom, the way he always did, on autopilot, without paying particular attention to what he was looking at. He was 23 years old and badly rattled by the disappearance of a bride he had personally photographed just hours before she vanished. When the negatives came out of the developer, he glanced at them under the darkroom's red light, saw nothing that looked unusual to his exhausted, distracted eyes, and set the whole batch aside. A week later, Gary Holt, overwhelmed by the tragedy and increasingly uneasy about even being associated with the case, told Walter to shelve the entire black and white project indefinitely. It didn't feel right, Gary said, to keep working on artistic photography, born out of a night that ended in something so terrible. Walter agreed. He labeled the strip of negatives with masking tape, wrote Ashford Wedding, Do Not Use, and put them in a box in the back of Gary's studio closet, where they sat, undeveloped into actual printed photographs, examined only once under hurried, distracted conditions, for the next 28 years. The investigation into Karen's disappearance stretched through the rest of 1987 and into 1988 without a single meaningful break. Tips came in from as far away as California, all of them dead ends. A woman matching Karen's description was reported working at a diner in Reno. It wasn't her. A body found in a river in West Virginia was tentatively linked to the case for 3 agonizing days before dental records ruled her out. Robert Ashford aged a decade in a single year. He kept the hardware store open because he didn't know what else to do with his hands, but customers noticed he'd stopped making conversation, stopped remembering names he'd known for decades. Diane took a leave of absence from teaching that turned into an early retirement she never fully recovered from. She kept Karen's bedroom exactly as it had been, the bed made, the vanity mirror dusted every single week, a small shrine to a daughter who might, for all anyone knew, still be alive somewhere. David Whitman, the young man who had waited nearly a decade to marry the girl he'd loved since childhood, spent almost 2 years unable to accept that his wife was simply gone. He kept their small rented house on Poplar Street exactly as they'd left it the morning of the wedding, refused to file for any kind of legal declaration of death or divorce, and drove the back roads of the county most weekends, searching ditches and tree lines for something, anything, that might explain what had happened. It wasn't until 1991, 4 years after the wedding, that David finally moved out of Millbrook entirely, taking a job with an agricultural company in Indiana, unable to keep living in a town where every single street corner reminded him of a wedding day that had ended in a nightmare no one could wake up from. He remarried eventually, in 1994, to a woman who by every account treated him with enormous patience regarding a grief that never fully left him. He kept a photograph of Karen in his wallet until the day he died in 2011, 4 years before the truth finally surfaced. Melissa Ashford, Karen's older sister, became the one person in the family who refused to let the case go quiet. She wrote to the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation every single year on the anniversary of Karen's disappearance, asking for updates, asking whether any new forensic technology might be applied to the old evidence. For years, the responses were polite and identical. The case remains open, but there are no new leads to report. She raised her own children with a framed photograph of Aunt Karen on the mantel, a woman frozen at 24 years old, while Melissa's own children grew up, graduated, and eventually had children of their own. Detective Frank Doyle retired in 1998, but he kept a copy of the case file in his own home office, unable to fully let go of the one investigation in his career that had never resolved. He died in 2009, and his own son, going through his father's things, found that case file and, moved by his father's decades of quiet obsession, mailed it to the current chief of the Millbrook Police Department with a note that simply read, "My dad never stopped thinking about this girl. Somebody should keep trying." Every June 13th, without fail, for 28 consecutive years, a small group gathered at St. Andrew's Lutheran Church at 7 in the evening to light candles on the church steps in Karen's memory, a tradition Melissa started the first anniversary of the disappearance and refused to let die even as attendance dwindled from the 50 or 60 people who showed up in the early years to the handful of family members who remained by the 20th anniversary. The Millbrook Grill kept a faded missing person flyer taped inside its front window for over a decade, the photograph of Karen slowly bleaching lighter and lighter in the sun until the diner's owner, an old classmate of Robert's, finally replaced it with a fresher print rather than take it down entirely. Local newspapers ran anniversary retrospectives every 5 years, each one interviewing an increasingly older and more visibly worn Robert and Diane Ashford, the headlines shifting almost imperceptibly over the decades from "Search continues for missing bride" to "Millbrook family still waiting" 20 years later, to, by 2012, the far more resigned, "The question that never left Millbrook." Robert Ashford gave his last interview to a local paper in 2006, 1 year before his death, and told the reporter that the hardest part was no longer the not knowing itself, but the slow realization that he might die without ever knowing, a sentence Melissa could not read aloud for years afterward, without having to stop and compose herself. Melissa's own children grew up with their aunt's face as a fixture of the household, a framed photograph on the mantel between school pictures of themselves, a woman who never aged past 24 while they moved through braces and driver's licenses and their own high school graduations. Melissa's son, the same toddler who had been curled up asleep in a stroller in the corner of the changing room the night Karen vanished, grew up, went to college, and was 29 years old, married with a child of his own, on the day his mother finally called to tell him his aunt had been found alive. He would later say that the strangest part of the entire experience was realizing he had grown an entire adulthood in the shadow of a mystery that resolved itself, in the end, in a single afternoon. By 2015, 28 years after Karen Ashford disappeared from her own wedding reception, the case had become something close to local legend in Millbrook, the kind of story parents told their children as a cautionary tale without ever really knowing the ending themselves. A true crime podcast with a modest but devoted national audience, one that specialized in unsolved small-town disappearances, had featured the case in a 2-part episode earlier that spring, drawing renewed attention and a fresh wave of tips, almost all of which led nowhere, exactly as they always had. But that podcast episode did something nobody could have predicted. It reached the ears of a 61-year-old retired photographer living 2 hours away in Dayton, Ohio, a man who had left the photography business entirely in 1990 and hadn't thought seriously about Karen Ashford's wedding in years. His name was Walter Pruitt. Walter's own life, in the 28 years between the wedding and that podcast episode, had taken him a long way from the darkroom he'd once shared with Gary Holt. He left the photography business entirely in 1990, unsettled in some way he could never fully articulate by the way that single black-and-white project, meant to be the beginning of something artistic and exciting, had ended up folded quietly into a tragedy nobody ever solved. He took a job in industrial sales, married in 1991, had a daughter in 1994, divorced in 2003, in a split he described to friends as amicable but exhausting, and moved 4 separate times over the following 2 decades, from Millbrook to Columbus, from Columbus to a suburb of Dayton, and finally, after his retirement in 2013, to a smaller house closer to his daughter and her own young family. Every single one of those moves involved the same routine: hire a truck, pack the essentials, and toss whatever boxes of old, unsorted junk had survived the previous move directly into the back corner of whatever new garage he now owned, unopened, unexamined, simply carried forward out of habit, and a vague, low-grade guilt about throwing away things that had once belonged to someone else's life, since much of what filled those boxes had come from Gary Holt's studio when it closed. Gary himself had passed away in 2001, and Walter had lost touch with almost everyone else from that brief, strange chapter of his life. The wedding, and the disappearance that followed it, had simply become something he tried not to think about, the way a person learns not to touch a bruise that never quite finished healing. Walter listened to the podcast episode alone in his car during a long drive to visit his daughter, and somewhere around the 30-minute mark, when the host described the desperate, fruitless search through 22 rolls of disposable camera film, a small, uncomfortable memory surfaced in the back of Walter's mind, a memory he had buried so deeply for so long that he almost didn't trust it. He remembered a box. He remembered masking tape. He remembered a strip of film he had developed under red light in a hurry, 28 years ago, and had never actually printed into photographs at all. Walter pulled his car over onto the shoulder of Interstate 70 and sat there for almost 10 minutes, his hands still gripping the steering wheel, trying to figure out if the memory was real or if his mind, primed by the podcast, was simply inventing something that felt dramatically convenient. When Gary Holt's photography studio had closed in 1990, Gary had given Walter several boxes of old equipment and personal negatives as a parting gift, telling him to do whatever he wanted with them. Walter had taken those boxes home, stacked them in the garage of the house he was renting at the time, and over the next 25 years, through 3 different moves and 1 divorce, the boxes had simply traveled with him, unopened, treated as clutter rather than evidence, sealed away in the dark corner of every garage he'd ever owned. It took Walter almost 3 weeks to actually work up the nerve to go looking for the box, partly out of fear that his memory was wrong, and partly out of a deeper fear that his memory was right. When he finally found it, buried under a stack of old tax documents and a broken lawnmower, and read the 4 words on the masking tape, Ashford wedding, do not use, his hands started shaking so badly he had to sit down on an overturned bucket in his own garage. The problem Walter faced next was one that would have seemed unthinkable in 1987, but was almost comically difficult in 2015. He had no idea how to properly process 28-year-old black and white film that had never been fully developed into physical prints, and had spent nearly 3 decades sitting in fluctuating temperatures in various garages across the state of Ohio. Modern film processing labs, accustomed to developing rolls that were, at most, a few years old, treated Walter's request with a mixture of confusion and caution. 2 labs in Dayton turned him away outright, unwilling to risk damaging degraded film with standard chemical processes. It was only through a referral from an old contact in the photography world, a woman named Patricia Nolan, who ran a specialty archival film restoration lab outside of Cincinnati, and who had experience handling severely aged and improperly stored negatives, that Walter finally found someone willing to attempt the delicate, painstaking work of recovering whatever images might still exist on that film. Patricia's lab, a converted barn on a quiet property outside of Cincinnati filled with vintage enlargers and carefully climate-controlled storage cabinets, smelled faintly of the same chemicals Walter remembered from Gary Holt's darkroom nearly 3 decades earlier. And standing in that doorway, film canisters in hand, Walter felt an unexpected wave of vertigo, as though he had stepped directly back into 1987 without any of the intervening years actually having happened. Patricia examined each roll under a loupe before she would even agree to attempt processing them, holding them up to a light box, murmuring assessments to herself that Walter couldn't fully follow. She warned him, when he dropped off the 4 rolls in early June of 2015, that there was a real possibility the images had degraded beyond recovery. Silver halide film does not last forever, especially not when stored improperly through decades of humidity, temperature swings, and basic neglect. Garages, she told him bluntly, were about the worst possible place anyone could have chosen to store undeveloped film, short of leaving it outside entirely. She told him it could take up to 2 weeks to know for certain whether anything usable would emerge, and that even if images did surface, they might be so degraded, so full of fog and chemical staining, as to be essentially unreadable. Walter drove home that day with an emptiness in his chest he hadn't expected, a strange grief for a resolution he might never actually get, having spent less than a month living with the possibility of an answer after 28 years of not even knowing there was a question left to ask. The 2 weeks that followed were, by Walter's own later admission, some of the longest of his adult life. He found himself checking his phone obsessively, rehearsing conversations with Patricia in his head, and twice driving past his own old storage boxes in the garage just to stare at the empty space where the film canisters had been, as though the absence itself might tell him something. His daughter noticed the change in him during a visit that week and asked, half joking, whether he'd fallen in love with someone, since he seemed distracted in a way she hadn't seen since his divorce. Walter told her only that he was waiting to hear back about an old project, unable yet to explain that the old project in question was the unsolved disappearance of a young woman he had photographed on the happiest day of her life. Patricia called him 11 days later. Her voice, when Walter answered the phone, had a careful, measured quality that told him immediately that whatever she'd found was significant. 3 of the 4 rolls, she explained, had degraded too badly to recover anything beyond faint, unusable shadows. But the 4th roll, the one labeled with a small number 6 written in the corner of the masking tape strip, had survived remarkably well, likely due to some minor variation in how it had been stored compared to the others. She had managed to recover 18 usable frames from that 4th roll. She told Walter she'd mailed him prints of all 18 images, along with high-resolution digital scans, and that he should expect the package within 2 days. Walter opened that envelope alone, at his kitchen table on a Tuesday afternoon in June of 2015. The first several photographs were exactly what he remembered shooting at the Ashford house that morning. Melissa curling Karen's hair, the bridesmaids laughing over champagne, Diane crying at the sight of her daughter in the dress. Walter felt a wave of something between nostalgia and grief looking at faces frozen at ages they no longer were, some of whom, he now knew from the podcast, had already passed away. He set aside the photograph of Karen at her childhood vanity mirror, staring at her own reflection with that unreadable, faraway expression, and felt an old, familiar unease crawl back up his spine. Then he reached the final 4 photographs in the stack, the frames that must have been shot late in the reception itself, after Gary had called him over to help pack equipment, in the handful of minutes Walter had spent wandering the edge of the Grange Hall parking lot while waiting for Gary to finish a conversation with the caterer. Walter had almost no memory of taking these particular photographs, but there they were, undeniable, in his own handwriting on the negative sleeve, time-stamped by the roll's position in the sequence, to somewhere between 9 and 10:30 that evening. The first of the 4 showed the side parking lot of the Grange Hall in the deep blue light of early evening, mostly empty, a scattering of parked cars along the gravel edge. In the middle distance, slightly out of focus, stood 2 figures. One, unmistakably, was Karen, still in her wedding dress, her white gown almost glowing against the darkening background. The second figure was a man, his back mostly turned to the camera, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a denim jacket that stood out sharply against the formal attire of every other guest at the wedding. The second photograph, taken moments later based on the sequence, showed the 2 figures standing closer together, Karen's head tilted downward, her posture tense, in a way that made Walter's stomach drop, even 28 years removed from the moment. The man's hand was resting on her forearm. The third photograph was the one that made Walter set down his coffee cup with enough force that it rattled against the kitchen table. It showed Karen partially turned toward the camera, her face visible for the first time in the sequence, her expression a raw, complicated mixture that Walter, even as an amateur, recognized instantly as fear layered over something that looked almost like longing. She was looking directly past the man's shoulder, out toward the road that ran alongside the Grange Hall property, as though checking whether anyone else was watching. The 4th and final photograph, the last frame on the entire roll, showed the 2 figures walking together toward a vehicle parked at the far edge of the gravel lot, just at the boundary where Doyle's canine dogs had lost her scent 28 years earlier. The vehicle was a pickup truck, dark in color, difficult to make out clearly in the fading light, but with one detail rendered sharp enough by a stray beam of the setting sun catching the rear bumper, a partial license plate, 3 characters clearly legible, the rest lost to motion blur and shadow. Walter did not sleep that night. He called the Millbrook Police Department the following morning, and by that afternoon, he was sitting across a desk from a detective he had never met, a woman named Detective Angela Reyes, who had inherited the Ashford case file from a long line of predecessors going back to Frank Doyle himself, and who had, coincidentally, listened to the same true crime podcast episode that had jogged Walter's memory in the first place. Reyes was 36 years old in 2015, having joined the Millbrook Police Department 9 years earlier after starting her career in Columbus, and she had inherited the Ashford file almost by accident, assigned to digitize a stack of the department's oldest unsolved cases as part of a records modernization project the county had pushed on every small department in the region. She had read through Frank Doyle's original handwritten notes late one night the previous winter, struck by the meticulous, almost tender care with which the old detective had documented every dead end, every follow-up call, every dashed hope, and had found herself thinking about Karen Ashford, on and off for months afterward, long before Walter Pruitt ever called her desk. When Walter described what he'd found in his garage and what Patricia Nolan's lab had managed to recover, Reyes felt something she would later compare, in a moment of uncharacteristic candor with a local reporter, to the sensation of a key finally sliding into a lock that had sat untouched for so long everyone had assumed it was rusted shut. Detective Reyes ran the partial license plate through the Ohio Bureau of Motor Vehicles Historical Registration database, cross-referencing it against pickup trucks registered in Millbrook and the surrounding 3 counties during 1987. The search itself took nearly a full week, complicated by the fact that Ohio's oldest vehicle registration records existed only on microfiche in a state records facility in Columbus, requiring Reyes to drive down personally with the partial plate number and sit for 6 hours in a windowless room, scrolling through decades-old registration cards under a magnifying lamp. The search eventually returned 11 possible matches for trucks registered with plates beginning in the visible 3 characters. Of those 11, Reyes was able to eliminate 7 immediately, based on vehicle color and model discrepancies visible in the photograph, cross-referencing each registration against known manufacturer paint codes for 1980s pickup trucks. Of the remaining 4, one name stopped her cold when she cross-referenced it against Detective Doyle's original 1987 case file, buried in a section of witness statements that had never been treated as significant at the time. A man named Thomas Rayner, no relation to Detective Reyes, despite the similarity in name, 26 years old in 1987, who had worked briefly at the grain and feed supply company owned by David Whitman's father, before being let go in early 1986, following a dispute nobody could fully remember the details of decades later. Buried deeper in the original case file, in a section of interview notes that Doyle had written but apparently never followed up on with any urgency, was a single line from an interview conducted with one of Karen's high school girlfriends in the summer of 1987. Karen mentioned once, a long time ago, that she'd dated someone before David, someone her parents didn't approve of, someone named Tommy. Doyle had noted the detail and moved on, focused at the time on more immediate leads that had all eventually gone cold. Nobody in 1987 had connected that single, buried line to the mysterious old friend from high school who had supposedly stopped by the reception to say congratulations. Detective Reyes tracked the name Thomas Rayner through public records and found that he had died in 2003, at the age of 42, in a small town in eastern Kentucky, of complications related to a workplace accident. His death, on its own, seemed to close off the most direct route to finding out what had actually happened to Karen. But Reyes, methodical in a way that would have made Frank Doyle proud, pulled Thomas Rayner's obituary from a Kentucky newspaper archive and found a detail that made her sit up straight in her chair. The obituary listed his survivors, and among them was a wife of many years, listed only as Diane R. Rayner. Karen's mother's name was Diane Ashford. It was a common enough name that Reyes almost dismissed the coincidence entirely, but something about the timeline nagged at her enough to keep pulling threads. She requested Thomas Rayner's marriage certificate from Kentucky Vital Records, And when it arrived by fax 3 days later, Detective Reyes felt something she would later describe to a local reporter as the strangest, most disorienting relief of her entire career. The marriage certificate, dated August of 1988, 14 months after Karen Ashford vanished from her own wedding reception, listed the bride's full legal name as Diane Renee Ashford, born in Millbrook, Ohio, in 1963. Karen had taken her mother's first name as her own new middle name identity, a small, quietly defiant detail that Detective Reyes found almost unbearably human once she understood the full picture. She had not disappeared into violence or tragedy, as the town of Millbrook had spent 28 years fearing. She had run, deliberately and with careful planning, into the arms of a man her parents had once forbidden her from seeing, a man she had apparently never fully stopped loving, even as she walked down the aisle to marry someone else. Reyes contacted the Kentucky County Clerk's office and, through several more days of careful, patient work, confirmed that Diane Renee Rayner, formerly Karen Ashford, was still alive, 62 years old, living quietly in the same small Kentucky town where her husband had died 12 years earlier, working as a receptionist at a local medical clinic, under a name that had, in the eyes of the law and the eyes of her community, been entirely legitimate for 27 years. Detective Reyes made the call herself, on a Thursday afternoon in late June of 2015, 28 years and 11 days after Karen Ashford disappeared from the Millbrook Grange Hall. The woman who answered the phone confirmed her name was Diane Rayner, and when Reyes gently explained who she was and why she was calling, there was a long silence on the other end of the line, long enough that Reyes began to wonder if the call had been dropped. Then the woman spoke, and her voice, according to Reyes's own account given later to Melissa Ashford, sounded exactly like someone finally setting down something impossibly heavy after carrying it for nearly 3 decades. What Karen told Detective Reyes, in a series of 3 long phone conversations over the following week, was a story far more painful and far more ordinary than anything the town of Millbrook had spent 28 years imagining. She and Thomas Rayner had dated secretly during her sophomore year of high school, before her parents found out and forbade the relationship, believing Thomas came from what Robert Ashford had once bluntly called the wrong side of the county line, a family with a reputation for hard drinking and worse decisions that Robert felt certain would only bring his daughter pain. Karen had ended the relationship at 17, believing at the time that her parents knew better, and had genuinely fallen in love with David Whitman over the following years, a love she insisted to Detective Reyes was completely real and never once fabricated. But 3 weeks before the wedding, at a gas station on the edge of Millbrook, Karen had run into Thomas Rayner for the first time in nearly 6 years. He had been passing through on his way to a construction job in West Virginia. The conversation, by Karen's own account, lasted less than 10 minutes, but it reopened something in her that she had spent years believing was permanently closed. Thomas told her he'd never stopped thinking about her. Karen, terrified and confused with her wedding rapidly approaching, told him to leave and never contact her again, and drove home shaking so badly she had to pull over twice. She did not hear from him again until the night of her wedding, when he showed up unannounced at the Grange Hall, having driven 3 hours from a job site after being unable to stop thinking about her, and sent word inside through a young caterer that an old friend was waiting by the kitchen doors. The note he handed her during those first 15 minutes near the kitchen simply read, "I'm leaving for good tonight after this. If there's any part of you that isn't sure, come find me before I go. I'll wait until 11. Karen told Detective Reyes that she spent the next 2 hours of her own wedding reception in a state of complete internal collapse, smiling and dancing and cutting cake, while a single sentence repeated itself endlessly in her mind. Any part of you that isn't sure. She realized, somewhere around 10 o'clock, dancing with her new husband to a song she would later be unable to remember, that there was a part of her that wasn't sure, that had perhaps never been fully sure, and that the life stretching out in front of her, comfortable and expected and approved of by everyone she loved, was not a life she had ever actually chosen for herself, so much as inherited. At 10:30, she told David she needed to change out of her dress, walked to the small changing room, took off the wedding gown, put on the simple ivory dress meant for the after-party, and then, in a decision she described to Detective Reyes as the single most impulsive and most honest thing she had ever done in her life, walked out the side door instead of back toward the reception. Thomas was waiting exactly where he said he'd be. They drove through the night toward Kentucky, and Karen never once looked back, not out of coldness, she insisted, but out of a fear so overwhelming that she genuinely believed, at 24 years old, that turning back would mean losing her nerve forever and living out a life of quiet regret that she couldn't bear to imagine. She never contacted her family, not because she stopped loving them, but because the shame of what she had done, of what she believed the entire town of Millbrook now thought of her, grew heavier with every year that passed, until it became a wall she genuinely did not believe she could ever climb back over. She married Thomas in 1988. She learned, only through occasional agonized internet searches over the years, careful never to leave a digital trail that might be traced, that her disappearance had become a genuine open missing persons case, that search parties had combed cornfields looking for her body, that her mother had kept her bedroom exactly as she'd left it for decades. Reading those details, Karen told Reyes, had been its own private, unrelenting punishment, one she believed she deserved and had no right to interrupt by simply calling home. Life in that small Kentucky town, Karen explained, had been quiet and small in a way she came to be grateful for over the years, even as the guilt of it never fully released its grip on her. She and Thomas rented a small house on the edge of town for the first several years, and Karen took a job as a receptionist at a doctor's office almost immediately, needing something to occupy the hours and quiet the constant low hum of anxiety that never fully left her. She never had children, a decision she told Detective Reyes had never been entirely deliberate, but which, looking back, she suspected had been shaped by some deep unspoken fear that bringing a child into a life built on so complete a lie would be a cruelty she couldn't forgive herself for. She kept almost no photographs of her life before Kentucky, only a single small snapshot of Melissa and their parents that she had folded into a hidden compartment of an old jewelry box, taking it out only rarely, always late at night, always alone, and always returning it to its hiding place before Thomas came home, not because he would have judged her, she said, but because she couldn't bear to have to explain the tears it inevitably brought on. There had been, over 27 years, several moments Karen described to Reyes as near misses, points where the wall she'd built around her old life had nearly cracked open entirely. In 1995, a co-worker at the doctor's office had mentioned, entirely by coincidence, having grown up near Columbus, Ohio, and Karen had spent the following 3 days in a state of quiet panic, convinced somehow that her old life was about to catch up with her, though of course nothing came of it at all. In 1999, watching a segment on a national news magazine show about long unsolved missing persons cases, she had seen, for exactly 4 seconds, an old photograph of herself flash across the screen as part of a broader segment on Midwestern cold cases, and she had turned off the television and sat in the dark for almost an hour afterward, unable to move. Thomas Rayner died in 2003 after a workplace accident at the construction company where he'd spent his career, and Karen, by then a widow of 40, told Reyes that she had come devastatingly close, in the weeks following his death, to finally calling her mother. She had even dialed the first 6 digits of her parents' old phone number in Millbrook before losing her nerve and hanging up, convinced that too much time had passed, that the damage was too permanent, that showing up now would only reopen a wound that had perhaps, mercifully, begun to close. She kept working at the same medical clinic for the rest of her life, eventually being promoted to office manager, well liked by her co-workers, most of whom, when Detective Reyes eventually spoke with them after the truth came out, described her as a kind, quiet, slightly private woman who almost never talked about her life before Kentucky, and whom nobody had ever once suspected of carrying a secret of that size. Melissa Ashford was sitting in her kitchen in Millbrook, 48 days after Walter Pruitt first opened that dusty cardboard box in his garage, when Detective Reyes called to tell her that her sister was alive. Melissa would later tell a local news crew that she dropped the phone entirely, that her own teenage son had to pick it back up off the kitchen floor and hand it to her, that she couldn't form actual words for almost a full minute. Diane Ashford, now 81 years old and living in an assisted living facility on the edge of town, was told the news by Melissa in person, sitting on the edge of her mother's narrow bed, holding both of her mother's hands. Diane's first words, according to Melissa, were not questions about where Karen had been or why she had left. Diane simply said, "Is she happy?" And when Melissa said she believed so, Diane began to cry in a way Melissa had never once seen in her entire life. 28 years of grief, finally finding an exit. Karen and Melissa spoke by phone for the first time 3 days later, a conversation that lasted almost 4 hours, much of it in complete silence, both women simply sitting on the line together, unable to find words adequate to the size of what had happened. Karen flew to Ohio 6 weeks later, in August of 2015, and Melissa met her at the airport in Columbus, and the two sisters, 62 and 56 years old respectively, stood in the middle of the arrivals terminal, holding on to each other and sobbing while strangers walked past them, most of them having no idea they were witnessing the quiet, unglamorous ending of a mystery that had haunted an entire small town for nearly 3 decades. Karen visited her mother that same afternoon. Robert Ashford, her father, had passed away in 2007, 8 years before his daughter's disappearance was finally explained, having gone to his grave believing, as he told Melissa many times in his final years, that he would never know what happened to his little girl. Karen sat in that assisted living room for 6 hours, holding her mother's hand, apologizing over and over, and Diane, according to Melissa, kept interrupting her daughter's apologies to say the same thing, again and again. "You're here. You're here. That's all that matters now. You're here." At one point during that first long afternoon, Diane asked Karen to help her out of bed and walk with her down the hallway to the small activity room where the facility kept a shelf of old photo albums residents were encouraged to look through with visiting family. Diane pulled down an album Melissa had put together years earlier, opened it to a page of wedding photographs, and pointed to a picture of 24-year-old Karen laughing at her own reception, radiant in her dress, utterly unaware of what the next several hours of her life would hold. Diane touched the photograph gently with one finger and asked her daughter, very quietly, whether she had been happy that day, even for a little while, before everything changed. Karen told her mother yes, that she had been happy, that the love she'd felt for David had been entirely real, and that the hardest thing she had lived with for 28 years was knowing that leaving him did not mean that love had been a lie, only that it hadn't, in the end, been enough to outweigh whatever unfinished thing still lived inside her from years before. Diane held her daughter's hand and said she understood far more than Karen probably expected her to, admitting for the first time that she had always privately suspected, in the deepest, most unspoken part of herself, that something about that final year before the wedding had felt slightly off, though she had never once said so aloud, not even to Robert, believing it wasn't her place to plant doubt in her daughter's heart during what was supposed to be the happiest season of her life. The following day, Melissa drove Karen out to Sycamore Street, past the small white house with the wraparound porch where they had both grown up, sold years earlier to a young family with 2 small children, who now kept a trampoline in the exact spot in the backyard where their father had once built a porch swing. Karen asked if they could stop the car for just a moment, and the 2 sisters sat together at the curb in silence, looking at a house that no longer belonged to their family, filled with a life that had continued forward for 28 years, without either of them fully participating in it. Melissa reached over and took her sister's hand, and neither woman said anything at all for a long time, because there was, by that point, very little left that needed saying out loud. David Whitman had died 4 years earlier, in 2011, still married to his second wife, still carrying that photograph of Karen in his wallet, having gone to his own grave without ever learning the truth. When Melissa told Karen this detail, sitting together in Melissa's kitchen on Karen's second night back in Ohio, Karen was quiet for a long time before saying that she believed, in some strange way, that David deserved better than the truth she had finally given everyone else, and that perhaps it was a kind of mercy that he never had to reconcile the sweet, uncomplicated boy who married her in 1987 with the decision she had made 2 hours later. Whether that was true comfort or simply the only way Karen could make peace with the pain she had caused him, nobody could say for certain, least of all Karen herself. Detective Angela Reyes officially closed the Ashford missing persons case in September of 2015, 28 years, 2 months, and 11 days after it was opened. There was no crime to prosecute. Karen Ashford had broken no law by choosing to leave her own wedding, however devastating the choice had been for the people who loved her. The case file, the same one Frank Doyle had kept in his home office until his death in 2009, the same one his son had mailed to the department with a handwritten note about his father never giving up, was finally marked closed and archived, a resolution built not on forensic breakthrough or dramatic confrontation, but on 4 rolls of forgotten black and white film that had sat quietly in a cardboard box through 3 house moves and 1 divorce, waiting 28 years for someone to simply open the lid. Walter Pruitt, the man who almost threw that box away without looking inside, was invited to Melissa Ashford's home that autumn, where he met Karen in person for the first time since he'd photographed her at her own vanity mirror on the morning of her wedding, when she was 24 years old, and staring at her own reflection with an expression he could still, 28 years later, describe in perfect detail. Karen thanked him, through tears, for finally opening that box. Walter, for his part, said only that he wished he'd looked inside it decades sooner, that he had spent almost 3 decades carrying an answer he never knew he had, and that the hardest thing he'd learned from the entire experience was how much unnecessary pain can quietly survive inside a single unopened box, waiting patiently in the dark for someone brave enough, or simply curious enough, to finally take a look. Millbrook, Ohio remembers Karen Ashford differently now than it did for the 28 years she was simply gone. The story is no longer told as a warning about small towns and the terrible things that might happen to a girl who disappears from her own wedding. It is told now, carefully and a little more gently, as a story about the enormous, complicated weight of the choices people make when they are young and terrified and standing at the edge of a life they aren't sure they chose for themselves, and about how even the deepest silences, the ones that seem permanent enough to survive a lifetime, can sometimes still be broken by nothing more dramatic than an old man cleaning out his garage, deciding, almost on a whim, to finally open a box he'd been carrying around, unopened, for far too long. If there is one thing worth carrying away from Karen Ashford's story, it might be this. Somewhere in this country right now, there is very likely another box like Walter Pruitt's, sitting quietly in another garage, another attic, another storage unit nobody has opened in years, holding inside it an answer that some family somewhere has been waiting decades to receive. If you know of a case like this, an old disappearance that never got its answer, a family that has spent years wondering, it costs nothing to ask the questions again, to look one more time, to open the box you've been putting off. Karen Ashford came home 28 years late. Some families are still waiting for their own version of that phone call, and sometimes all it takes to finally give it to them is one person willing to look a little closer at what everyone else assumed was nothing.